How can you govern an empire when your own brain is starving for oxygen? June 1945. The Victory Parade. Stalin stands atop the mausoleum, but the steel has cracked. The dictator was fighting an enemy he could neither purge nor intimidate, his own body. A minor stroke followed the celebration. It left a permanent tremor in his left arm. It brought episodes of disorientation. The man who redrew the map of Europe could no longer find his way through a single hour. Yosef's medical charts were a death warrant. Confidential reports revealed a biological collapse. The doctor wraps the cuff. He pumps the bulb. The needle on the tonometer jumps, quivering at the top of the scale. 200/100. This was a permanent hypertensive crisis. The arteries in his brain and heart had hardened into stone. His left ventricle was dangerously enlarged, straining to push blood through a dying system. Thick tobacco smoke fills the office. It clings to the heavy curtains. Stalin burned through 30 cigarettes every single day. No exercise, no sunlight. He lived by candlelight and shadow. His biological clock was shattered. He stayed awake until dawn, fueled by salt and alcohol. He demanded the same from his subordinates. Any emotional spark could trigger a fatal rupture. Power had become a cage of flesh and bone. He maintained this lethal rhythm for over 12 hours every day. Fear of his own failing health forced Stalin to transform his bedroom into a fortified bunker. By 1946, the dictator had turned his daily life into a claustrophobic ritual of survival. Paranoia dictated the architecture of his routine. The kitchen was the first line of defense. A chef prepared the meal under the watchful eye of guards. Then, a designated taster sampled every dish. Stalin waited in silence. Only after the taster remained standing did the leader touch his plate. Every night was a tactical maneuver. He never slept in the same room twice. One night the study, the next a small bedroom in the wing. To deceive potential assassins, he employed multiple bodyguards who looked exactly like him. Even his driver followed a strict, chaotic protocol. The car had to be parked in a different spot every single morning to prevent any pattern from emerging. Routine was a death sentence. The darkness of the Kudsevo dacha held no peace. A shadow flickered against the heavy curtain. Stalin was on his feet instantly. In the silence, the metallic click of a pistol hammer being cocked echoed through the room. He trusted no one. The MGB, the state security apparatus, expanded this fear into a domestic science. They established kvartiri, special monitored apartments for the elite. Microphones hid behind wallpaper and inside chandeliers. Generals, ministers, and Politburo members lived in auditory traps. Private conversations became state evidence. This system of kvartiri served as the blueprint for the total surveillance that later consumed all Soviet life. Every whisper was recorded, transcribed, and bound into secret dossiers. Lavrenti Beria was the primary reader of these transcripts. The Kremlin became a ghost ship. Official meetings in the gilded halls were now mere theater. Real power migrated 20 minutes outside Moscow to the Kudsevo dacha. Here, the state was governed not by law, but by the volatile moods of a dying old man. Lavrenti Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, and Nikolai Bulganin arrived as guests. They stayed as hostages. Every night followed the same ritual. Heavy plates hit the mahogany table. Bottles of Georgian wine appeared. Crystal glasses clinked in a room where the air felt like lead. No one dared to speak first. Everyone waited for the host to set the tone. Stalin watched. He studied the sweat on their foreheads and the way their hands shook. "Without me, the imperialists would devour you like rabbits," he whispered. He didn't want loyalty. He wanted terror. The Kudsevo dacha transformed from a residence into the shadow capital of the Soviet Union. Here, between midnight and dawn, the fate of millions was decided by a nod or a frown. A single misplaced word meant treason. A silent pause meant death. The elite of a superpower spent their nights paralyzed by the gaze of a single man. While the inner circle trembled at nightly dinners, 200 million citizens worshipped a shadow. By 1949, the living Stalin began to dissolve. The face on every wall remained immortal, but the man behind the stone mask was fading. Between 1949 and 1953, he delivered only 3 official speeches. The image of the Iron Leader had replaced the leader himself. A hoarse, breaking voice struggled to breathe between sentences. He read from papers with visible effort. The words didn't flow, they stumbled. In 1952, he published his final theoretical work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. The logic was fractured. The arguments were incoherent. This was a sharp, terrifying contrast to the cold clarity of his earlier writings. The machine he built functioned by inertia. The man who directed the industrialization and survived the most devastating war in history was now a ghost in his own hallways. He had designed a system of absolute personal dependence. Now that system became his cage. Stalin had finally turned against his own shadow. He retreated into the reinforced silence of the Kremlin, effectively becoming a prisoner of the paranoia he once used to rule. Why torture your own cardiologists when your heart is barely beating? Stalin disappeared from the podiums in 1949. He retreated. The great leader turned his progressing psychosis on the very men keeping him alive. In October 1952, the paranoia crystallized into a state-mandated hunt. 9 Kremlin doctors, most of them Jewish. Stalin ordered their arrest. The charge was a fabrication, a Zionist plot to assassinate the Soviet elite through false diagnoses. He didn't want a cure, he wanted a conspiracy. The Lubyanka became a laboratory of pain. Medicine turned into an instrument of the state. These were the elite of Soviet science, now reduced to broken bodies in cold cells. Stalin's mental decay accelerated. He spent 14 hours a day in a stupor, alternating with bursts of verbal aggression. He forgot faces. The goal was a second Holocaust. Plans were already drafted for the mass deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to Siberian labor camps. Only the dictator's death would halt the freight trains. The doctors faced the conveyor. No rest, no closing of eyes. Guards shook them awake every time their heads dropped. 10 days, 15 days. The interrogation lasted 168 hours without a single minute of sleep. The madness of the Lubyanka cells spilled over into the homes of the Kremlin elite. Not even the architects of the Soviet nuclear shield were safe. Stalin wanted the bomb. He didn't want to invent it, he wanted to steal it. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device. The secret was out. Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall had funneled the Manhattan Project blueprints directly to Moscow. How was the shield forged? Through the Gulag. Lavrenti Beria turned the nuclear program into a slave colony. Tens of thousands of prisoners dug tunnels in the Kazakh steppe. They built laboratories with their bare hands under the barrels of machine guns. Radiation was a secondary concern. At a private dinner, the report landed on Stalin's table. One sentence: "We are at the level of the Americans." But parity with the West didn't bring peace. It brought purges. Vyacheslav Molotov, the loyal shadow of the leader, learned this in early 1949. Stalin ordered the arrest of Molotov's wife. Polina Zemchuzina was Jewish. The charge? Ties to Zionist organizations. The system demanded total submission. Molotov did not protest. He did not beg. He watched as they took her to internal exile. Every night, Molotov sat at his dining table. 2 plates were served. One for him. One remained empty. A silent reminder of a wife he couldn't protect. He ate his dinner in the presence of a ghost. Molotov continued to serve the man who destroyed his family. In 1948, Marshal Tito proved that a communist leader could say no to the Kremlin. He rejected total subordination and chose an independent path for Yugoslavia. Stalin responded with fury. He expelled Tito from the Cominform and branded him a traitor. A hunt began. Assassin after assassin failed. Yugoslavia did not break. The monolithic image of the dictator cracked. For the first time, Stalin lost a fight. The ego was wounded. The paranoia was fed. The fear turned inward, toward the Ministry of State Security. In 1951, Stalin ordered the arrest of Viktor Abakumov, the head of the MGB. The accusation was absurd. Stalin claimed Abakumov shielded a Zionist conspiracy that had already breached the Kremlin's medical staff. The chief of state security was now a prisoner. He was the man who perfected the interrogation. Now, the meat grinder processed him. Inside the Kremlin, the air turned toxic. Stalin issued a new order. No official could speak of his health. No reports, no whispers. Even the mention of his deteriorating body became a death warrant. Abakumov was tortured for months. No one came to save the chief executioner. In the end, they led him to a basement and shot him in secret. The execution of Viktor Abakumov sent a clear signal. The madness had breached the walls of the dacha. It was no longer a private ailment. Clinical paranoia was now the official ideology of the Soviet Union. By 1946, Joseph Stalin stood at the peak of human power. He had crushed Hitler. He had seized Eastern Europe. His shadow stretched from Berlin to the Pacific. But inside the Kremlin, the victor was retreating. The halls grew silent. Footsteps echoed against cold stone. No one wanted to speak first. How does a superpower function when its brain is rotting? The state mirrored its leader. Stalin began to fear his own cooks. He suspected his own doctors. Even the walls of his residence felt like enemies. Absolute power became a distorted mirror of his deepening psychosis. He ordered a new system of internal surveillance. It went beyond simple spying. It was a mechanical expansion of a single man's fear. By the end of the year, the machinery of government existed only to reflect the delusions of a dying old man. More than 2 million citizens returned to a country that treated victory as a crime. State paranoia demanded a blood sacrifice. The first to fall were those who survived the front lines and German camps in 1945. 2 million people. The NKVD issued a secret directive in June 1945. Stalin signed it personally. Soldiers who saw Europe were now ideologically contaminated. They expected flowers. They found cattle cars. Steel doors slid shut. The interior smelled of unwashed bodies and rising rot. Children cried in the dark. Dogs barked on the platforms as hammers drove nails into the wooden slats of the windows. Tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war went from Nazi barbed wire directly to the Gulag. They were traitors because they hadn't died. The state treated logistics like a frontline offensive. In 1944 and 45, the regime ordered the total deportation of Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and Meskhetian Turks. More than 1 million people were forced into trains headed for Central Asia. The operation to remove the Crimean Tatars took exactly 3 days. Whole villages stood silent by sunset. In the empty houses, Slavs moved in to erase the memory of the previous owners. On the tracks, people died of hunger, cold, and suffocation in locked wagons. The expulsion of an entire nation required the same resources as a major military breakthrough. The clearing of the Crimea was finished in 72 hours. The deportation trains were still rolling towards Central Asia when a new shadow fell over the Soviet South. 1947. While millions of displaced citizens froze in cattle cars, those left behind in Ukraine and Moldova began to starve in their own homes. A catastrophic drought scorched the fields. The harvest vanished. Why did the state seize the last bags of grain from dying peasants? To feed a geopolitical ambition. Stalin looked at the maps, not the granaries. He had just founded the Cominform to cement his grip on Eastern Europe. Ideology demanded tribute. The contrast was lethal. Soviet grain ships departed from Black Sea ports, bound for new socialist allies. At the same time, Soviet peasants ate grass and sawdust. 1 million tons of wheat went abroad to buy loyalty in the West. Back home, the villages turned into graveyards. The logic remained cold and consistent. Feeding the puppet regimes of the Cominform outweighed the lives of the people who grew the bread. Internal collapse was a statistic. External influence was power. Official records stayed silent. No emergency was declared. No aid was requested. The state simply watched as the famine of 1947 claimed 1.5 million lives. The same ruthless logic that starved millions in 1947 turned against Berlin 1 year later. Stalin aimed to suffocate 2 million people. Isolation became a weapon of war. He started with silence. The Red Cross was banned. Foreign charities were expelled. He ordered the seizure of United Nations food supplies meant for war-torn regions. Then, he cut the final thread. Direct correspondence with relatives abroad became a crime. Families lost each other in the informational void. How did he handle dissent on the borders? He used the same mechanism of forced displacement. 1947 saw the start of Operation Vistula. Stalin personally approved the plan in a meeting with Polish communist leaders. The goal was ethnic cleansing. They targeted Ukrainian minorities suspected of nationalist ties. Soldiers arrived at dawn. 140,000 people were driven from their homes. In 1948, the focus shifted to the heart of Europe. Stalin ordered a total land blockade of Berlin. No trains, no trucks, no coal. He wanted to starve the western sectors into submission. For 11 months, the city lived on the edge of extinction. The sky became the only lifeline. Allied planes roared over the freezing ruins. They dropped flour, milk, and fuel every few minutes. Stalin watched the airlift but hesitated. He feared a direct war and forbade his pilots from shooting down Western transports. Instead, he authorized mass arrests and local sabotage against pro-Western sympathizers. The regime uprooted entire communities to break their spirit. In Poland, the army loaded the last of the 140,000 deportees into cattle cars for relocation to industrial zones. The shadow over Berlin spread fast. Moscow began exporting its methods. Fear was no longer a local product. It became the Soviet Union's primary export to Eastern Europe. In Prague, the transition was surgical. 1948. The Soviet ambassador oversaw the coup from the front row. Democratic minister Jan Masaryk became the final obstacle. Then, a body appeared under a ministry window. Defenestration disguised as suicide. Resistance in Czechoslovakia died on that pavement. In Hungary, Matyas Rákosi took the lead. He didn't just study the Soviet model, he replicated it line by line. Purges, re-education camps, mass surveillance. The satellite states became mirrors reflecting Stalin's own paranoia. The ultimate irony waited in East Germany. The NKVD seized the infrastructure of the Holocaust. Sachsenhausen, the former Nazi concentration camp, reopened as Soviet Special Camp No. 7. The gates remained the same, only the guards changed. The cells filled with anyone suspected of Western ties. Dissidents, former officials, the innocent. 60,000 prisoners passed through these wire fences. 12,000 people died there of starvation and disease. The empire of fear stretched from the barracks of Sachsenhausen to the frozen mines of Kolyma. On March 1, 1953, it collapsed onto a rug at a dacha outside Moscow. The most powerful man in the world lay in a pool of his own urine. He was 74 years old. He was alone. The guards heard nothing. They were too terrified to knock. For hours, the ruler of 1/6 of the planet stayed on the floor. His breathing was heavy and bubbling, a rattle of air through a paralyzed throat. Was there a reason for this silence? Stalin had spent decades destroying initiative. He taught his circle one lesson: wait for orders. Now, there was no one to give them. The clock ticked. The guards stood behind the door for hours. They knew the rules. You do not enter without an invitation, even if the leader is dying, even if he is drowning in his own fluids. 4 days of agony followed. His inner circle arrived. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev. They looked at the body. They saw a helpless old man with half-closed eyes. No one called a doctor for nearly 24 hours. Stalin had recently jailed his best physicians in the doctor's plot. The survivors were too afraid to touch him. Their hands shook as they took his pulse. The dictator who sent millions to their deaths was now a clinical case. A stroke had stolen his voice. His main weapon was gone. He could no longer command, so he was left to die. The system he built was a mirror of his paranoia. It functioned only when he pointed a finger. When the finger stopped moving, the state froze. The end did not come with the funeral. In 1961, 8 years after his death, the state acted again. Under the cover of darkness, soldiers removed his body from the mausoleum. They buried him near the Kremlin wall. They used concrete to seal the grave. The man who defined an era was hidden by the government he created. The name was erased from the maps. Stalingrad became Volgograd. The statues fell. The official silence lasted decades. A pool of urine spread across the expensive rug. Beside it lay the man who had terrified 170 million people. Joseph Stalin was face down, motionless and completely helpless. Secrecy killed him. For years, the Kremlin hid every detail of the leader's declining health. By the evening of March 1, 1953, this silence turned into a death sentence. The guards finally used a spare key. They pushed the heavy door open. The room was freezing. In the center of the floor, the Generalissimo lay in his own waste. His clothes were soaked. His eyes were half closed, fixed on nothing. Stalin was still breathing, but the sound was wrong. It was a heavy, wet rattle echoing in the absolute silence of the Kuntsevo dacha. He was a prisoner of his own biology. For decades, his voice was the most dangerous weapon in the Soviet Union. One word meant life. One word meant the firing squad. Now, his vocal cords were useless. The stroke had erased his speech. The most powerful man on earth could not call for a glass of water. The servants and guards gathered around the body. They did not move. They did not call for an ambulance. They stood in the freezing room, watching the god of their world die slowly. No one dared to touch him without an order that could never come. They stood in the silence of total paralysis. Why did the staff wait until the dead of night? Fear of waking his wrath was stronger than the instinct to save his life. The dictator had vanished behind a heavy oak door, and his own rules became his cage. By March 1st, the halls of the Kuntsevo dacha fell into a deathly freeze. No sound emerged from the bedroom. The guards stood like statues, following the standing order, never disturb the comrade Stalin. They watched the clock. 1 hour, 5 hours, 10. The trays began to pile up on the floor. First, the untouched breakfast. Then, the cold lunch. Finally, a dinner tray that no one would ever eat. Maria Tanovna, the housekeeper, paced the hallway. She spoke only in a dry, thin whisper. The guard Starostin answered in the same hushed tone. They stood in an empty corridor, surrounded by the silence of a tomb. How long could a man survive without a word? For 17 hours, the machinery of the Soviet Union stopped at that door. 17 hours. Exactly the time it takes a train to travel from Moscow to Leningrad. In those 17 hours, a superpower became a vacuum. Outside, motion sensors tracked every squirrel in the trees. Inside, the internal sensors remained dead. The security logs showed nothing because nothing inside moved. By 10 o'clock that night, the terror of silence outweighed the terror of his voice. The housekeeper and the guard argued in the dark. They debated the protocol of intervention for 60 minutes. Every second of that whispered discussion was another stroke of the clock for the man on the floor. At 11 o'clock, they finally turned the spare key and decided to act. The heavy silence that followed the discovery was a chilling contrast to the way the night of February 28th began at the Kuntsevo dacha. At 9 o'clock, the iron gates opened. 4 men arrived: Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin. The inner circle knew the unwritten mechanics of survival. Rule 1: show absolute deference. Rule 2: laugh at every joke. Rule 3: never be the first to leave. To break the rhythm of the host was to invite a death sentence. The atmosphere was a toxic blend of feigned joy and lethal tension. Glasses clinked constantly. Stalin forced the pace, alternating between deep red Georgian wine and high-proof vodka. Under the flickering chandeliers, the little father of nations reminisced about his youth. He mocked absent officials. The guests watched his eyes, searching for a trap in every sarcastic comment. They drank because he drank. They stayed because he stayed. At midnight, the dinner reached its mandatory conclusion. Stalin stood up and gave the order to move. The group walked toward his private cinema to watch the latest Soviet propaganda films. The guests followed Stalin to his private cinema. On screen, Soviet propaganda flickers in the dark. The leader remains unusually quiet. His breathing is heavy, labored. He closes his eyes for long stretches, but snaps awake the moment anyone stirs. The fear in the room is physical. Did the inner circle notice the fading pulse of the empire? Nikita Khrushchev remembered a strange warmth. Stalin called him Mykola, the Ukrainian diminutive. He used it only when relaxed. At 4:30 in the morning on March 1st, the guests finally head for the exit. Stalin stands with visible effort. He walks to the vestibule unaided to perform his mandatory ritual of farewell. He seems in high spirits, joking as the heavy doors close behind his visitors. The dacha falls into its final routine. Stalin retreats to his bedroom. He changes into a white pajama shirt and loose trousers. There is no doctor, no alarm, only the mechanical habits of a dictator. He drinks a single glass of mineral water. He picks up a report on industrial production and signs 2 minor decrees. These are his last conscious acts. At approximately 5 in the morning, the light goes out. The state machine didn't just break, it paralyzed itself. When the guards found the body, they didn't call a doctor, they called the secret police. By 2 in the morning on March 2nd, the phone rang in the office of Lavrenti Beria. This was the protocol. Under the Soviet system, a dying leader wasn't a medical emergency, he was a state secret. Security clearances mattered more than a pulse. The ambulance couldn't even pass the dacha gates without a direct order from the Ministry of State Security. The scene inside the room was a slow-motion collapse. Guard Starostin and Matrena Butusova stood over the fallen titan. They lifted the heavy, unresponsive body. They moved him to a sofa in the adjacent dining room. Someone found a traditional Georgian blanket. They draped it over the man who had ruled with iron for 3 decades. His breathing was the only sound in the suffocating silence. It followed a terrifying pattern. A long stop, total apnea. Then a sudden, desperate burst of hyperventilation as the lungs fought for air. Why was there no doctor? The hierarchy of fear had deleted the very idea of medical help. Beria didn't rush. He didn't sound the alarm. Instead, he took his time, contacting only Georgy Malenkov. They drove through the dark Moscow night, arriving at the dacha around 4 in the morning. 4 in the morning. Black limousines pulled up to the Kuntsevo dacha. Lavrenti Beria and Georgy Malenkov entered the room. They didn't bring doctors, they brought calculations. Who gained from this delay? The death of the leader offered a singular chance to dismantle the old power structure and carve up the empire. The 2 men stood over the sofa. Stalin lay paralyzed. His breathing was heavy, a rhythmic, guttural struggle for air. His pulse was weak. One side of his body had turned to stone. Beria leaned in close. He looked at the man who had terrified the world for 30 years. He saw a helpless organism, not a god. Every minute of a hemorrhagic stroke kills millions of neurons. Medical science calls this the golden hour. Beria called it an opportunity. They watched him. They waited for the sun to rise. No phones were picked up. No sirens broke the silence of the forest. The elite of the Politburo feared a recovery. If Stalin woke up and saw them acting without orders, it meant the firing squad. If he died, it meant freedom. From this bedside calculation, a systemic rot was revealed. Across the Soviet Union, the most brilliant medical minds were sitting in prison cells. The purge had hollowed out the hospitals. Stalin's own paranoia had liquidated the only people capable of saving his life. When the sun finally hit the windows, the order was given. The loss was total. They had waited 13 hours. The leader of a nuclear superpower lay on a soiled sofa. Around him, the finest medicine the Soviet Union had left to offer. It was a scene of primitive desperation. When the doctors finally reached Kuntsevo, they found a void where expertise should have been. Dr. Lukomsky and Dr. Vasilenko stood over the body. 3 general practitioners trailed behind them. None were stroke specialists. They were simply the ones not yet arrested. The physical reality was devastating. Blood pressure peaked at 210/110. His right side was a dead weight. One pupil was dilated and fixed. His breathing followed the jagged, gasping rhythm of chain Stokes. This was a massive cerebral hemorrhage. The brain was drowning in its own blood. In 1953, the peak of Soviet science met the limits of a medieval village. A pressure of 210 meant the vessels had likely burst hours ago. Modern neurosurgery was a fantasy here. Instead, they reached for the methods of the 19th century. The doctors handled the body with trembling hands. They placed 8 leeches behind his ears and on his neck. The black, slimy parasites swelled as they drank the blood of the generalissimo. It was a frantic attempt to lower intracranial pressure. They administered blood pressure medication rectally because he could no longer swallow. Every movement was recorded. Every reflex was absent. To stabilize the fever and ward off seizures, they applied cold compresses. In 1952, the bed in Kuntsevo was surrounded by second-line therapists. They were terrified. The elite doctors were gone. A year earlier, the purge had reached the hospitals. Stalin outlawed illness. Any mention of his declining health became a crime. Mentioning the leader's blood pressure meant an immediate surveillance file. Assistants scrubbed clinical histories. Personal secretaries burned medical records. Smoke rose from the dacha's chimneys. It smelled of scorched paper. Years of clinical data turned into ash. By 1952, the paranoia peaked with the doctor's plot. Stalin ordered the arrest of 9 Kremlin medics. Most were Jewish. The charge, murdering Soviet officials through false diagnoses. Among them was Vladimir Vinogradov. He was a world-class cardiologist. He was one of the few men who knew the rhythm of Stalin's heart. Vinogradov did not make it to trial. He was tortured. He died in a prison cell months before the stroke. The very man who could have managed the leader's hypertension was eliminated by his patient's hand. The MGB investigation expanded. It was no longer about a few doctors. It was about an entire people. The plan included the mass deportation of the Soviet Jewish population to camps in Siberia. The death of the dictator stopped the trains. The liquidation of the Kremlin doctors was not a finale. It was a prelude. While the medical elite rotted in Lefortovo, Stalin prepared a terminal strike against his closest circle. Vyacheslav Molotov, Lazar Kaganovich, and Anastas Mikoyan. These were not just subordinates, they were the architects of the revolution. Now, they were targets. The dictator spent his final weeks compiling secret dossiers on his oldest comrades. The charges were fabricated. The evidence was forged in the basement of the MGB. How does a revolution end? It eats itself. The atmosphere in Moscow turned from cold to lethal. In the high-ceilinged offices of the Kremlin, the party elite lived in the shadow of nocturnal raids. Citizens whispered. A poorly timed joke or a suspicious glance meant a 10-year sentence. Stalin had transformed the Soviet state into a mirror of his own mind. Hostile, unpredictable, paranoid. At the Kuntsevo dacha, the inner circle became a collection of ghosts. They ate without speaking. They laughed without joy. Each man applauded at dinner while wondering if he would survive until dawn. Stalin was retreating into his fortress. He suffered from chronic insomnia. Throughout the night, the heavy echo of his boots rang through empty, wood-paneled corridors. He paced alone. He moved from bedroom to bedroom, never sleeping in the same place twice. He was a man listening to voices no one else could hear. Suddenly, at 3 in the morning, light would flood a random window of the dacha, then another, then total darkness. The leader of the superpower was no longer governing a nation. He was conducting a private, desperate war against himself. The war inside his body was ending. The state's war for his throne was just beginning. Stalin lay paralyzed at the Kuntsevo dacha. By March the 3rd, the biological reality was grim. His temperature spiked to 39 degrees. His lungs began to fail. A dark, cyanotic tint spread across his skin, signaling a desperate lack of oxygen. Then came the hematemesis, vomiting of blood. The doctors did almost nothing. They provided only palliative care. Any aggressive intervention was a death sentence for the physician. If he died under the needle, it was an assassination. If he lived, it was a miracle. They chose to wait for the end. While the body rotted, the machine hummed with sterile precision. On March the 3rd, the Presidium released the first official bulletin. It spoke of a grave cerebral hemorrhage. The language was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. It was neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It was a vacuum designed to hold the nation in suspense while the elite moved their pieces. While the thermometer at the dacha showed 39 degrees, the corridors of the Kremlin were already cold with calculation. Ministerial portfolios were being traded over a dying man's breath. Lavrenti Beria did not wait for the pulse to stop. He launched into a feverish reorganization of the security services. He knew that in Moscow, power belonged to the man with the most boots on the pavement. Beria ordered the mobilization of MVD units to strategic positions across the capital. He held private, hushed meetings with high-ranking military commanders to secure their loyalty before the official announcement. The secret maneuvering around the vacant throne ended on the evening of March 5th. The transition from a living god to a biological corpse took exactly 96 hours of agony. Stalin lay in his own sweat. His breath slowed. The gaps between inhalations grew longer. 2 minutes of absolute silence. Then a ragged, desperate gasp. His body temperature plummeted. Blood pressure fell to levels incompatible with life. At 21:50 on March 5, 1953, the pulse stopped. The man who terrified half the world was now just a collection of failing organs. The autopsy began with the chest cavity. Doctors saw the reality Stalin had hidden for decades. His heart was a massive, overworked muscle. It weighed 580 grams. This was nearly 200 grams above the norm. The muscle was thick, scarred, and exhausted. His brain told the same story. A massive cerebral hemorrhage had destroyed the left hemisphere. A small thalamic artery had simply burst under the pressure. The scales and scalpels revealed the truth. Surgeons found severe arteriosclerosis and multiple old microinfarcts. Stalin had been a walking medical disaster. His paranoia kept the best doctors away until the end. The findings officially ruled out any theories of poisoning. Stalin died from cardiovascular diseases he had stubbornly ignored for years. Stalin's death at 9:50 p.m. on March 5th triggered a massive logistical machine. The USSR began preparing its dead god for the greatest farewell spectacle in history. Within 1 hour, the body arrived at a secret Moscow laboratory. The air inside the facility stayed heavy with the sharp chemical stench of formalin and glycerin. Specialists moved with surgical precision. They used the same protocols developed for Lenin decades earlier to create the illusion of immortality. The mechanics of preservation began at the arteries. Needles pierced the skin. Formalin surged through the vessels. Dr. Boris Zabarsky, a veteran who had preserved Lenin, oversaw every injection. Zabarsky's team worked 12 continuous hours. They treated the face with carminic acid to mimic the flush of life. They applied thick layers of glycerin to stop the skin from drying out. The laboratory was a factory of artificial peace. They combed the famous mustache. They crossed the hands over the chest. They sculpted a mask of serenity to hide the agony of the final hours. The illusion almost broke the next morning. A partial failure of the cooling system accelerated decomposition. Gray spots appeared. The embalmers reacted instantly, applying additional layers of heavy makeup to hide the decay. They placed the finished artifact into a casket of solid mahogany. Zabarsky adjusted the lighting to give the face an artificial expression of absolute calm. October 31st, 1961. The Kremlin shuts down Red Square under the pretext of technical maintenance. Plywood shields block the view. The gates are locked. Behind the stone walls, the state prepares to rob its own sanctuary. How do you bury a dead god? In silence, under the cover of darkness, without flowers or speeches. Inside the mausoleum, the air is thick with the smell of chemicals and cold stone. A specialized brigade of the Kremlin Guard enters the tomb. No cameras, no crowds. They move toward the center. Soldiers grip the heavy sarcophagus. They lift. The physical extraction begins. The body of Joseph Stalin, once the center of a global cult, is hauled through narrow underground tunnels. Boots echo against the concrete. The transition is surgical and cold. Outside, by the Kremlin wall, a pit waits. The ground is hard, frozen by the early Moscow frost. The rhythm of the work is mechanical. Soldiers plunge shovels into the dirt. Metal clangs against stone. They dig a trench among the graves of minor party officials. No marble, no pedestal, just an anonymous hole in the earth. The burial is a mirror image of the 1953 funeral. 8 years ago, millions sobbed in the streets. Today, there is only the sound of falling soil. The party leadership watches from the shadows, ensuring the removal is total. Stalin is lowered into the dirt like a disgraced clerk. No military honors follow. No cannons fire. The tomb remains a blank space for years. No bust, no inscription. Until 1970, the grave of the man who ruled half the world stayed a nameless pit. After the secret exhumation at the Kremlin wall, the state apparatus launched a quiet dismantling of bronze idols across the country. Moscow, 1958, the dead of night. Specialized demolition teams moved in on the massive equestrian statue standing before the Kremlin. Steel cables tightened. Heavy cranes groaned under the weight of tons of bronze. Engineers blocked several streets to hide the process from the public eye. The work required precision and absolute silence. This giant monument to one man stood in sharp contrast to what came next. In smaller cities, the regime avoided unique art. They replaced towering figures of the leader with generic, mass-produced monuments to socialist progress or war victory. The bronze gods simply vanished. Citizens went to bed under the gaze of an empire's creator. They woke up to empty pedestals. The machinery of the state worked while the people slept. If a monument was too large for one night, the army cordoned off the area under the guise of technical repairs. They cut the statues into pieces and hauled them away in unmarked trucks. By dawn, the city squares looked different. Authorities executed these removals under the cover of darkness. The trigger for this urban purge was pulled years earlier. On February 25, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech. He spoke for over 4 hours. 1,436 delegates listened in absolute silence. The CIA obtained the text. The New York Times published it in full. Decades of blind loyalty collapsed overnight. In Poland, the revelations fueled the Poznan riots in June. In Hungary, they sparked the October Revolution. Soviet tanks crushed the uprising, but the myth was already dead. In China, Mao Zedong watched from Beijing. He saw betrayal. The Sino-Soviet split began with those pages. But removing a monument from a park was easier than erasing Stalingrad from the map. This city survived the Wehrmacht's strikes. 2 million people died for it. For veterans, its name was a scar. For the party, it was a problem. The official decree arrived. It cited historical geography. The Volga River was the logic. Politics proved stronger than the memory of war. In November 1961, workers climbed ladders. They smelled fresh paint. They covered the old signs. Stalingrad ceased to exist. The new maps read Volgograd. November 1961. The street cleaners of 1961 were finishing a job started 5 years earlier. The gears of the Great Purge of memory began turning long before the statues fell. How do you keep a grip on a throne built of skeletons? You blame the dead man who put you there. February 25, 1956. Moscow, the 20th Party Congress. Nikita Khrushchev climbed the podium of the Great Hall of the Kremlin Palace. He opened a folder. Inside lay a document of 24,000 words. He began to read. The session was closed. No journalists, no cameras, no foreign diplomats. 1,436 delegates sat in the dark. The acoustics of the massive hall swallowed every sound but Khrushchev's voice. He read for more than 4 hours. The report was titled, "On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences." It was a systematic demolition. Khrushchev detailed a litany of crimes, mass executions, and strategic blunders. He stripped the man of steel of his infallibility. The elite sat frozen. Some delegates fainted. Others suffered heart attacks. Their world was dissolving into 1,436 numbered copies of a secret transcript. The hall listened in total silence. Khrushchev's 4-hour indictment struck the delegates of the 20th Congress like a physical blow. It was not a political report. It was a psychological execution. The speaker's voice echoed in the heavy silence of the hall. He dismantled 30 years of history. Systematic paranoia, the mass purges of the 1930s, disastrous military failures in the first months of the war, the fabricated doctor's plot. Each sentence acted as a scalpel, cutting the living God out of the state's chest. For the elite, the world collapsed. Some delegates fled the hall in tears. Others suffered nervous breakdowns right in their seats. The psychological shock was lethal. In the following weeks, several high-ranking officials committed suicide. They realized their entire careers were built on a lie, or worse, on blood. Control was the only priority left. The party bureaucracy went to work. Typed copies of the transcript rolled off the machines. Typists worked in secured rooms. The air was thick with the sharp chemical smell of fresh printer ink. Every page was tracked. Officials assigned unique identification numbers to each copy. They distributed these numbered bulletins to regional committees throughout March and April. The secret stayed in the shadows. Reading sessions happened only behind closed doors. Information moved in concentric circles, trickling down the party ladder under strict supervision. How deep did the leak go? Far enough to reach the West. A Polish journalist handed a copy to Mossad. Israeli intelligence passed the document to the CIA. The secret of the century was now a commodity. In June 1956, the absolute control of the Kremlin evaporated. The text appeared on the front page of the New York Times. The hysteria of the 1956 party elite was merely a pale shadow. 3 years earlier, a different kind of mass psychosis paralyzed the Hall of Columns. The House of Unions was once the Moscow Choral Society's ballroom. Now, the imperial marble vanished behind heavy black and red drapes. Thousands of red carnations and white roses lined the perimeter. Massive wreaths from all 15 Soviet republics created a monumental funeral garden. Inside, the air stayed at 12 degrees Celsius. Precise humidity controls fought back the decay. The coffin was a masterpiece of polished mahogany and gilded bronze, lined with white silk. Even here, paranoia ruled. MGB agents stood in the shadows, watching for sabotage against a dead man. The lighting was theater. Sharp spotlights focused on the face. A soft golden glow enveloped the catafalco. Every detail was calculated. The honor guard changed every 30 minutes. This rhythmic rotation maintained a perfect frozen image of grief for the cameras. From the morning of March 6th until the night of March 9th, a human river flowed through the hall. Thousands of boots shuffled across the floor in a continuous, rhythmic procession. The human river on Trubnaya Square hit a wall of steel. It was a trap. The authorities closed several main arteries at once, creating a lethal funnel. Thousands of people were compressed into a space meant for hundreds. What happens when a million-strong crowd hits a military cordon? A deadly crush. The pressure became mechanical, physical. Rear rows pushed forward, unaware of the carnage at the front. People were pinned against the sides of military trucks. Ribs snapped like dry branches. The air was 8 degrees below zero. You could hear the wet gasps of the suffocating. Heavy snow fell. Winds hit 40 kilometers per hour. Those who fell never stood up again. They were ground into the pavement by thousands of boots. The system chose silence over rescue. To maintain the facade of perfect grief, the MGB launched a cleanup. Military trucks loaded the crushed bodies under the cover of darkness. They weren't taken to morgues, but to local hospitals. Doctors received a direct order: change the cause of death. Thousands of death certificates were forged to list natural causes. The Kremlin feared a repeat of the Kodinka field tragedy of 1896. Back then, 1,389 people died during the coronation of the last Tsar. Stalin's successors could not let his funeral start with the same omen. Official reports from March 7th admitted to only 109 victims. It was a lie. Declassified documents later revealed the true scale of the three-day wake. More than 1,500 people died just to catch a glimpse of the coffin. While MGB trucks cleared the dead from Moscow's side streets, the state launched a flawless funeral machine. Public grief was a scripted performance. Private relief was a diplomatic secret. Winston Churchill sent formal condolences to the Kremlin. His public words spoke of a great warrior. In private, his tone shifted. He admitted to his inner circle that with the dictator gone, the world could finally breathe. The West watched. The East knelt. China declared 3 days of national mourning. North Korea and Vietnam ran editorials crowning Stalin the eternal guide of socialism. The cult of personality survived the heart attack. March 9th, the official climax. The ceremony combined orthodox liturgy, military precision, and pure political theater. 4 black Prussian horses pulled an artillery carriage. On top sat the coffin. 200 officers formed a rigid human corridor from the palace to Red Square. The rhythm was mechanical. A phalanx of T-34 tanks moved in parallel formation. Steel tracks ground against the frozen pavement. The sound of T-34 engines filled the voids between the buildings. The square was a vacuum of sound. Only 2 noises remained. The rhythmic crunch of thousands of jackboots on the icy cobblestones. The low guttural idle of tank motors. The funeral procession halted. At the podium, the new masters of the Kremlin stepped to the microphones. Behind the masks of grief, a silent war for the vacant throne had already begun. Georgy Malenkov spoke first. 10 minutes of measured, frozen institutional continuity. No emotion. No trembling voice. He represented the state machine, cold and functional. Lavrentiy Beria followed. He spoke for 12 minutes. It was the longest and most theatrical performance of the day. He called Stalin the vigilant father of the nation, weaponizing the cult of personality to crown himself the primary heir. Only 3 months remained before his own colleagues would arrest him. Nikita Khrushchev took his turn. 8 minutes of dry, academic theory. He intentionally chose a dull, bureaucratic tone to fade into the gray background of the Central Committee. While others fought for the spotlight, Khrushchev calculated the risks from the shadows. He watched. Vyacheslav Molotov closed the ceremony. 5 minutes, aimed at the world beyond the Iron Curtain. His message was simple. The Soviet foreign policy remains unchanged. The speeches ended. The red-draped casket moved toward the granite entrance of the tomb. The leaders stepped back, clearing the way for the final descent into the mausoleum. The burial did not end with the grave. It ended with a construction site. Engineers and embalmers had exactly 36 hours to rewrite the geography of the mausoleum. They worked in shifts. They removed the remains of Lenin to the lower levels. They hollowed out the stone. They installed a dual climate control system with autonomous sensors and underground floodlights. The goal was a museum of flesh. Soft yellowish light now hit the vacuum-sealed glass capsule from below. By the time the doors reopened, the names of 2 men were etched in gold Cyrillic on the black marble. Stalin lay to the right of Lenin. How long does a cult survive on inertia? Between 1953 and 1961, 10 million pilgrims descended into that silence. It was a secular shrine of glass and cold air. The industry of grief moved faster than the mourning. While the public wept, the state printing presses ran at full capacity. They produced 500,000 commemorative postcards. The images showed the dictator frozen in a state of artificial peace, surrounded by a sea of flowers. 500,000 copies of a dead face went into circulation across the empire. The glass sarcophagus, once the centerpiece of 500,000 commemorative postcards, was now just a target for historical erasure. The state decided to cut the dead leader out of its own skin. On November 2, 1961, the doors of the Lenin Mausoleum reopened. 2 days prior, a midnight crew had scrubbed the granite. They removed the name Stalin from the facade. Inside, the architecture returned to its original state, a sanctuary for one. Stalin was gone. Not just from the room, but from the records. Did the people notice? They had no choice. Censors took to the archives with literal scalpels. This wasn't just policy, it was a surgical operation on collective memory. Stalin had mastered this art in the 1930s, airbrushing out executed allies like Yezhov or Trotsky. Now, the system turned the blade on its architect. Retouchers worked in silence. In official photographs, a familiar silhouette would vanish, replaced by a blurred background or a sudden, empty patch of sky. In textbooks, the Great Patriotic War became a victory of the collective party, not the generalissimo. Films featuring his face vanished from the shelves. History became a plastic mold. The state poured new facts into old dates. By the time the sun set on that November day, the face of the man who ruled for 30 years had simply ceased to exist on paper. While history books were being rewritten, the iron gates of the archives remained locked. Khrushchev dismantled the statues, but he guarded the system. Full transparency was a death sentence for the new elite. After all, the leader himself had signed the execution lists in Ukraine. The party needed a scapegoat. It chose a dead man. Every crime, every purge, and every famine was pinned on Stalin's deviated personality. The institution remained holy, only the man was flawed. The rehabilitation process moved with the cold precision of a stopwatch. Special commissions filtered the NKVD and MVD files behind closed doors. No public access, no journalists. In 1961, the state began issuing thin slips of paper. These certificates were masterpieces of bureaucratic brevity. They stated a name. They stated the word innocent. They offered no apologies. No financial compensation followed the years of forced labor. Thousands of citizens held their freedom in their hands, but the details of who betrayed them stayed buried in the folders. The machine simply erased the period from 1924 to 1953 as a collective hallucination. The climax of this theater arrived in late October. The state scrubbed the name of the dictator from the tomb and adopted a new program for the future. By the end of the year, the official purification reached its limit. The Great Purge was reduced to a clerical error in 1961. By the end of 1961, the purge was complete. The system did not just bury the man, it liquidated his presence. The absolute ruler of the largest empire on earth became a ghost. His physical agony lasted 5 days in March 1953. His political execution took 8 years. The de-Stalinization campaign acted like a scalpel, cutting him out of the Soviet landscape. How do you erase a god? You start with the streets. One day, thousands of cities and avenues bore his name. The next, they were renamed. You move to the squares. Bronze and granite monuments vanished overnight. Workers dismantled the towering statues in silence. Only the empty pedestals remained. Then came the mausoleum. For years, 2 bodies lay under glass in the center of Red Square, Lenin and Stalin, side by side. In October 1961, the locks turned at night. A special brigade carried the sarcophagus out. They stripped him of his place of honor. They moved him to a simple grave by the Kremlin wall. The sensory shift was absolute. Visitors entered the tomb expecting 2 figures. They found only one. The void was deafening. The Great Purge of 1924 to 1953 was reduced to a clerical error. Historians rewrote the textbooks. The leader of the revolution became a footnote, an uncomfortable figure, a series of deviations on the path to socialism. The dictator feared oblivion more than death. His successors turned that fear into reality. They used the very tools he perfected, censorship, fear, and silence, against him. The architect of the socialist pantheon was evicted from his own creation. Nothing remained but the scars. Millions of shattered lives and the phantom pain of a society that could not forget what the state refused to remember. By December 1961, the empire had no name for its creator.